Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 15 of the Book Talk Today podcast. Today, I'll be speaking to Niall Kishtainy. Niall is an analyst, researcher, and writer of economics and economic history. And today, we'll be discussing his book, A Little History of Economics. Niall, it's a pleasure to have you on.
Lovely to be here.
So, like we were saying before we started, I read your book, I want to say 18 months ago, and having studied economics at school and economics partly at university, I studied politics at university, but I did some optional modules in economics. And I was always questioning why disciplines, especially in social sciences, stand alone. I always confused about why there's not this interrelated, interconnected discipline. And when I read your book, it very much made me happy to see that there is a way or a vehicle to find some similarities between different disciplines. What was it about the subject of economics that first interested you or made you go down this path?
I mean, in terms of when I first studied it, which was, sort of university years, I guess economics is looking at the really big questions of human welfare and human well-being. Ultimately, how do people get enough food, clothes, medicine to survive and to flourish? And why do some people not manage to get what they need? So it's looking at these really big questions, if you like, of the sort of material basis for human well-being. And these are huge, compelling questions that thinkers have been engaging with for centuries. Today's economics does it in a particular way, has a particular way of doing that. But I think those kinds of questions are what draw people to it. I mean, there are different reasons that people get into economics. For some people, it's they're interested in sort of finance and the stock market and those kinds of things. For me, that was always a sort of subset of a much bigger set of questions, which is really about human well-being. And this is what the book is trying to do, is to set economics in this very broad sort of context, rather than being what some people perceive it to be, as this very kind of detailed mathematical set of tools, which that stuff is important as well, but there's also this sort of broader picture. And that I think that then connects to what you were saying earlier about economics being an interdisciplinary thing. It's something that talks to philosophy and politics and history, or it should do anyway. It's not always taught in that way, but that's what I'm really interested in. So I've always been interested in actually the connections between economics and other disciplines. So I hope that comes through in the book as well.
Yeah, it definitely comes across in the book. And I actually feel like that's a flaw in the way that it's taught, because very much when you're at school, it's very much about economic models.
Yeah.
So you start going to sort of graphs and diagrams on supply and demand and inelastic goods, and it just gets a bit boring. But once you find out where it sits in the global picture of what the purpose of it is, I think it becomes a lot more interesting.
Absolutely. So that's definitely how today economics is taught, and how most people are sort of introduced to it, is through these little models and little pieces of apparatus, like supply and demand or whatever. And actually so that's certainly how most sort of college courses start. And also I think there are a lot of very good introductory economics books out there, and a lot of them do the same sort of thing. So they'll use those little bits of technique, those bits of apparatus, and then use them to analyze aspects of the life that we see around us. And that's really fascinating, and I'm not sort of criticizing that at all. I suppose what I was trying to do in this book was to say, well, actually economics there's an intellectual history to it as well. It's not just so that sort of toolkit approach to it is almost a bit like, I wonder, treating economics as a kind of engineering, where you've got these little tools that you use. That's fine, but there's also a kind of intellectual story, which is that people have been thinking about economic issues since, the book goes back to the ancient Greeks, thinking about this struggle to put in place the material basis for well-being. That story is an incredible story of sort of intellectual history and sort of disagreement and debate. And, there have been many schools of economists and many different ways of looking at this problem. And actually that tends to get lost in a lot of the sort of modern way of talking about economics. So, economics as one of the humanities, economics as being something like philosophy or history or even literature, I find that a very well, that's something that's neglected in the way that economics is taught today. And yeah, some people can get put off by all the maths and all the graphs that you pointed out.
Mm.
That stuff is really important. I'm not sort of criticizing that, but I think it's important to have that sort of broader context as well.
I think that's why a lot of people aren't interested in it. I think once you bring the humanistic element of the economic models into it, and you touched upon it in the book as well, and I liked especially that you started with the Greeks, because I think a lot of people, especially in economics, they just go Adam Smith is the first guy,
Yeah.
and then they completely forget about everything that came before Adam Smith. And I liked that you went into the Greeks and started talking about the academy and what were the big thinkers thinking about what is the role of money and wealth in society.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important to go back to the fundamental aspects of that.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of histories of economics do start with Adam Smith, and there's probably some good reasons for that. I mean, in a way, he was writing on the sort of cusp of the Industrial Revolution, when the sort of commercial economy, the industrial economy, was really burgeoning and creating the sort of economy that we have today. He was talking about markets and how markets generate wealth. That's really important, and in a way, that is a staging post in the sort of intellectual history. But as you said, I wanted to go further back and look at thinkers that probably today we might not say, oh, maybe they weren't doing economics in the way that we see it today. But to me, I suppose I wanted to cast my net quite widely and have quite a broad definition of what economics was. Anyone who's thinking about these sort of material problems, even if it is done within, say, a religious context or a classical philosophical context. So I've got a later chapter on the sort of middle age and Thomas Aquinas and the theologians who are thinking about, okay, how can you behave in an economy that's actually starting to commercialize and moving towards something that will turn into capitalism? How can you behave in that kind of economy and still be a good Christian? So how can you set a just price that's sort of moral? To me, that's still kind of in a way, it's a moral problem, but it's about economics. It's about how morality and religion connects with economics. So I wanted to talk about that as well. So yeah, there's a broad set of sort of issues and philosophical, moral questions that connect with the story that I wanted to sort of include there.
Yeah, you definitely did that in the book. If we're going to take a step back, how would you define economics in the most simplistic way? If someone was to come to you and say to you, how would you define economics?
Well, I would say it's about it's questions about the material requirements for human society and for human beings to survive and to flourish. That's an incredibly sort of broad. So in a modern context, that would be, studying the different elements of the economy. So the consumption, the investment, the consumers in there, the firms, how the economic output flows between those different segments, and then what the outcomes are in terms of people's income and inequality and all that sort of stuff. That's the sort of modern take on that very broad question. As I said, earlier takes on it were much more to do with, how do these economic questions, how do they connect with sort of religious precepts and so on. So it's really, I think it's it's a very broad field, and there are many ways of sort of making that question more specific. So the really modern way of doing it, often economics nowadays defined as the science of scarcity. And often that's how the first textbooks start. It's like you have a scarce set of resources. How do you decide the trade-offs, for example? That was very much a 19th century sort of concept. To me, that's just one version of this broader question. That's not how all economists look at the problem. Again, to mention another one, you look at Marx. He's coming at that problem in terms of how do power relations work in society? How does differential power between social classes, affect that bigger question of the material outcomes for people? So I think of it in very broad terms. Um, for some people, it's when you think about economics, you think, oh, it's about finance and money and the stock market. But I think if you see that sort of within that broader way of thinking about it, finance and the stock market is just one little element of that.
Yeah, definitely. It just fits in as just one of the pieces in the puzzle
One of the
of
pieces, exactly.
economics. On to Marx quickly. It was interesting in the book you touched upon his sort of personal story about how he came about to write and his writing style. Like, I didn't know about his personal mental and also physical health issues, and that became evident in the book. I was thinking from that perspective, do you believe that that affected the way that he was writing? Because I feel like reading that story about his background, about what he had to go through to write it, there was a bit of spite
Yeah.
within that layered upon the things that he was writing. I was wondering whether you felt the same way.
I mean, it's a great question. I can't really answer that.
I
So that,
know, but
but, I mean, in a way, he is this sort of, he's an economist, he's a philosopher, but he's also this sort of thundering kind of Hebrew prophet, actually, you know, writing secular material, but it's got this sort of almost at times millenarian, prophetic feel to it. And yeah, I mean, I think, I think, so when he was writing Capital, he did have these terrible health problems and his carbuncles. This is one thing that the biographers always talk about, that, he wrote the last pages standing at his desk because the carbuncles on his body were so painful. And, then he finished the last page and says, I hope the bourgeoisie will remember my carbuncles till their dying day. And I've heard, I think some biographers saying, if you look at the sort of original manuscript, there are, the handwriting is quite crazy. Had this sort of tiny, handwriting. There are almost pages where it looks angrier, and you wonder whether that was he was having a tough day with his carbuncles or wasn't feeling too good.
yeah.
There's a lot of anger, and he was a very sort of turbulent character. So I'm sure that's in the mix there somewhere. I'm not as enough of an expert Marxian biographer to know precisely, but
Yeah, it was just something that came to mind when I was
yeah,
reading the story. I thought to myself, I wonder how many people through history have written something that is quite, like you said, prophetic in a way, but sort of going against the grain and in that way. But then they had their personal issues on top of that. Because I'm big into, I like finding relationships between different fields. So I like the psychological aspect of an individual affecting his economic, philosophical policy, his political views, because that inherently is related to it. The way that you think determines obviously the ideas that come from it.
absolutely right. I mean, economics is not it's not physics or maths where there's the atom or there's the experiment that you're doing. It's a work of the imagination to some extent. How do we create stories and pictures about this thing that is actually invisible? I mean, it's an economy. What is that? You can't actually see the economy as such, so it's a work of the imagination. So yeah, the whole question of the sort of psychological needs and characteristics of the people that write it. I mean, in a way, it's maybe not a million miles away from literature, people writing literature and novels. And of course, you can't separate the person's psychology and deep beliefs and biases from the way that they approach things.
Yeah, the way they perceive the world, definitely. One thing that I was thinking about, or one individual that I never came across, was Quesnay, the French doctor. And interesting, I didn't know about the tableau économique and how that implicitly employs the idea of laissez-faire. Why do you think that his work is somewhat overlooked, especially at school?
I don't know. Quesnay from Quesnay, the French. So this was sort of the first school of economists, so called. They're called les économistes, and the physiocrats. The idea of rule by nature. So this idea that the economic value is located in the agricultural sector, and that there's a sort of circulation of value through the economy, and he created this, this tableau, this first model. It doesn't tend to be taught that much. I mean, I don't know. I mean, a lot of the certainly a lot of the way that economics was taught to me and is taught in colleges, it's very much sort of Anglo-American kind of discipline. Perhaps that might be part of it, that we tend to focus on that sort of tradition. Maybe there's just I mean, history of thought in general is neglected. I mean, if you study a sort of economics course at university, you won't actually study Adam Smith. You'll probably have heard of him, Marx, but you'll never actually sit down and read through his books unless you're sort of doing some very specialist. Of course, you really want to sort of go for that, but it's generally not part of the core syllabus. So there's a sense that none of them are highly studied. There is something in Kishtainy that is quite modern, actually, which was, he was saying, leave the economy alone and let it breathe. So the idea of laissez-faire actually comes from that school. We still use that terminology to mean sort of, let the economy, don't sort of smother the economy with too many taxes and regulations and so on. So there's a legacy there in the language that we use. But absolutely, I mean, Smith, who came just after, is obviously much more well known. He's perhaps talking about ideas that are more modern and more connected to the way that the economy is now. So the Kishtainy and those guys were really saying agriculture is where the economic value resides, and actually manufacturing is this sort of it's almost like parasitic. And obviously nowadays we don't, industry and manufacturing, that of course that's where economic value came from following the Industrial Revolution. So in some ways it seems like a rather slightly antiquated kind of theory. It's definitely got one foot very much in the past, in the pre-industrial economy. So perhaps it doesn't quite.
At that time, he would have seen the world through that. He wouldn't have foreseen.
He would have seen the world through that lens. He didn't know
what we see now
happening. I mean, even in Adam Smith, he doesn't talk so much about sort of factories, and he wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776 when the Industrial Revolution was really only just starting. So he wouldn't have used the kinds of terminology that we use today. Sure, I mean it can be a puzzle. Why do certain thinkers get? And there are many in the book that you don't really learn about if you do an economics course. I mean, I think people like Veblen, for example, fascinating thinker. Again, not someone who comes in much to the sort of standard syllabus.
Yeah, definitely. I recently read a book, Moneyland, by Oliver Below. Have you read that book? So in that book, it talks about the financial crisis and the role that individuals play, self-interest in particular. And we just brought in Adam Smith and in The Wealth of Nations. He talks about the idea how self-interest actually can govern the economy, because it's through self-interest that people can grow and develop and the economy can flourish. Do you think somewhat that antiquated model of self-interest is actually the last, I want to say, 40 years has really exposed that level of self-interest because it's been exploited to a degree?
So you mean that has sort of cast doubts on that way of thinking?
Yeah, cast doubts on that model of thinking about it's purely about self-interest.
Sure. I mean, it's interesting to sort of look at often. So with Adam Smith, what we often do, we often have this very sort of anachronistic way of looking at him, which is sort of reflecting back the way that we do this with, of course we always do this. Look at history and ideas through the lens of our own time. You can't not do that. With Adam Smith, one thing that often happens is to sort of really emphasize the fact that, or to impose on him this idea that, he was arguing just for sort of free markets and unbridled self-interest and all that sort of stuff. I think he's a much more nuanced sort of thinker than that. And in fact, he was a philosopher, so he was steeped in sort of moral philosophy. He's got another sort of parallel work The Wealth of Nations, the Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is all about morality and how people, moral virtue and all that. That he was a philosopher, and actually, so his idea of self-interest, I think needs to be placed within a sort of broader context, which is it works if people are decent, and I suppose his notion of decent is a sort of, Anglo-Scottish, prudent, sort of commercial, emerging middle class type of person who's prudent and honest, gentleman's,
proper gentleman.
And within that context, self-interest actually works quite well. But it depends on people being honest and not trying to swindle each other and so on. That's often very different from some of the notions of self-interest that are flying around these days or in the last, which is very much a much harder edged sort of libertarian, neoliberal kind of self-interest, which I think is quite different to what Adam Smith was talking about. He was talking about a kind of enlightened self-interest, as opposed to, I don't know, well, you can look at some of the disasters of neoliberalism and what happened in the financial crisis, and that's not kind of what Smith was talking about.
But if you look back at the roots, especially in sort of the roots of neoliberalism, if you can look at Reagan or Thatcher, so Reagan in particular, in the book you talk about the fact that he lauded the ideas of Adam Smith so much that they used to wear the tie with his. So do you think it's more the fact of a misunderstanding of what he was actually speaking about, or a twisting of the ideas to suit their individual?
Well, a bit of both. And I mean, we all, in a sense, we can't, as people with, we all have political views and ideologies, and politicians have programs they want to implement and views of the world. And we'll always try and look for support for those from different thinkers in history, and hopefully a prestigious thinker like Adam Smith, and often that involves a twisting of what that person is. I think it's a sort of inevitable part of kind of human discourse that we do that. I mean, of course, Marx is the big one. I mean, look at what's been done in his name and claimed, and so on. So yes, I mean, I don't think Adam Smith would have been particularly happy to see the Reaganites wearing his, ties with his picture on the front, but yes, that was one philosopher economist who was sort of harnessed in the cause of sort of neoliberalism. Sure.
Going back to Marx, it was very interesting when I was reading the book. I thought to myself, why did Karl Marx connect so much, especially in the late 1800s, early 1900s? Why did he connect with people? And my thought was that it was due to, the rising inequality amongst people, and they sort of, it was just right place, right time. Because if someone came out with the ideas of Karl Marx, not knowing Karl Marx, imagine the previous Karl Marx never existed, and someone came out with that theory now, people would just be like, that guy's crazy, just ignore that guy, because that just doesn't work. But I think that right place, right time with Karl Marx at that time was why that philosophy rose up. But do you have that way of thinking when it came to his teachings and what he was saying?
Yeah, I mean, why do some thinkers why does their thought spawn whole schools of thought that then live on beyond their work? I mean, that's an incredibly complex question, but yes, I mean, there were circumstances at the time that meant that his work did, and then you had the political situation, early 20th century in Russia, and it was used in a modified form as a way of underpinning that. You could imagine another set of historical circumstances where he would be, have been just another one of many prophet-like 19th century thinkers who built huge, elaborate systems of history and so on, who was not remembered. I mean, I think that perhaps in recent years Marx has had a bit of a moment. I mean, not that people are talking about having necessarily a communist revolution, but actually the main part of Marx, the main interesting, I think, element of his work is not so much the stuff about communist revolution, but actually analysing capitalism and thinking about how power relations and inequality sort of tends to get reproduced under capitalism. And, I mean, I think probably a lot of that is as relevant today as it was back then, actually. So
I definitely think there's a resurgence of those ideas. I think because people are questioning the ideas of the capitalism that we see now and seeing the inequalities rising, I think that's why you're seeing the resurgence, especially of people wanting that type of economic way of thinking. Whether it's the right one, I don't know whether that's the case, but
yeah,
I definitely think there's a conversation or discourse to be had about the utility of the current system that we have.
absolutely. And what you take from, but Marx was writing in the middle of the 19th century, what you take from, going back to the earlier point about you see things through the lenses of your own moment. What we'll take from him will be different to what people would have taken from him at the beginning of the 20th century. But I mean, he's such a fertile, complex, contradictory thinker that there are likely to be things in there that resonate with our own time, probably to do with how power works and so on, within how power works within the economy. Yeah.
When I was reading the book, you also mentioned Alfred Marshall and the idea of marginal utility. I was reading the example you gave about the hot dogs and the Coke.
Yeah.
I was wondering whether you can just elaborate on the idea of marginal utility, because I was reading it and I thought to myself, I think I would like him to be explaining this to me in person, because I think it might make a bit more sense. So for those that are listening or watching, can you explain what marginal utility is and the impact that had?
Sure. I mean, it's actually to do, I think at the beginning, I mentioned that one way of thinking about economics is to do with scarce resources. So this very much comes out of thinkers like Alfred Marshall in the 19th century. So thinking about, basically the idea is you've got a scarce amount of stuff, you've got a fixed amount of stuff, and you need to kind of optimize. How do you mix it? How do you decide whether to have more hot dogs or more Cokes, because you can't go on forever. There's a fixed amount, there's a scarcity. And similarly for firms deciding what to do, how to produce things, there's a sort of scarcity. So you have to sort of optimize. So the idea of marginal utility is just, this is looking at an individual. I've only got a certain amount of money that I can spend on, if you make it very simple, hot dogs, and I think my example was hot dogs and cans of Coke, like this. So marginal utility is just, if I eat one more hot dog, how much extra happiness does that give me? So suppose my level of happiness now is 50, right? 50, I don't know what 50 somethings,
Yeah.
and then I eat a hot dog, and now I'm 51, right? So that the marginal utility is 1, okay. But suppose I drank a can of Coke, and that pushed me up to 53, right? So that the marginal utility of the can of Coke is 3. So actually in this situation, the marginal utility of the can of Coke is bigger than the marginal utility of the hot dog. So what an optimizer would do is actually keep consuming cans of Coke, because that gives you more of a utility hit. Yeah, that's the idea of marginal utility. But the other idea that's connected to this is the idea that marginal utility tends to diminish. So if I drink, one more can of Coke, yeah, great. But if I drink another, I might start feeling a bit sick. If I drank another 100, that would be pretty terrible. So at some point it will kind of level off.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the idea is that you basically, the optimum mix is when basically the marginal utility of an extra hot dog is the same as a marginal utility of an extra can of Coke, and then it's kind of perfectly balanced. My consumption is perfectly balanced. Okay, so that's called optimization, and this is because at that point I can't increase my utility by any other mix of cans of Cokes and hot dogs.
Because you're perfectly satisfied. Is that the idea?
Perfectly satisfied. So with the amount of money that I have, I've achieved the perfect mix of cans of Coke and hot dogs. Now, of course, it's a very sort of contrived example. In practice, you have many things that you're trying to buy, but it's the idea that people are basically optimizers. So they've got a fixed amount of money, they've got their income, and they're a fixed amount of money in the short run. Okay, imagine I've got a weekly wage. I've got to decide what to do with it. The idea that people are able to calculate rationally, okay, how do I mix the things that I buy? What mix of things should I buy? But it also extends to, for example, a firm. What mix of inputs should I use to produce my whatever it is that I'm producing? So that's a particular way of thinking about the economy as this sort of optimizing system. So when you hear people talk about sort of rational economic, they'll say rational economic man, but yeah, rational economic people, rational economic men and women are basically people that do that really well. And that's been the sort of basic assumption that's been the basic sort of psychological model of human behavior that has been embedded in a lot of modern economic models, is that people do, that's what people do, that's what people are. They're people that consume and optimize. They consume rationally and they optimize. And from that you can derive all sorts of theories, and you can actually express that quite nicely in mathematical terms, which is probably why it's been one reason why it's been so popular. Obviously it's a very crude notion of human behavior, but you can express it in terms of maths quite easily, and then use it to construct all sorts of models.
Yeah, and the application for the individual and the firm, I think, is why it's probably been applied over time, because you can apply that to, let's say, like you said, a firm, with how they go about their marginal utility of, let's say, one client over another and one employee over the other. But then you can apply it to myself, like a marginal utility of one book might be more than another, just because I feel like it gives me more value.
And so they even apply it to the labour market, that you are you're a consumer, but you're also a supplier of labour. You think about, okay, the marginal utility of you compare your wage rate to, okay, how much benefit do I get from having a bit of extra leisure or going to work? So you even use that optimizing framework to think about. So you can sort of use it everywhere, and that's what economics has actually, sort of a lot of modern economics does. It kind of applies it everywhere, and that's very powerful. But there's obviously huge shortcomings to it, and that leads into a lot of the critiques of economics, is that it's used that much too sort of promiscuously in a way, but that model's used everywhere. And you can, so there's even there's a chapter in there about Gary Becker, who was a University of Chicago economist, who sort of uses that, who started applying that model, that way of thinking, to actually areas that you would normally think of not being part of economics, so part of sociology. So he had a whole, he wrote papers on the economics of crime, for example, that used that same sort of optimizing model. So a criminal might think, okay, what's the benefit, what's the monetary benefit of committing this crime versus, the disutility of being punished for it, and so on. And even applied it to sort of marriage, thinking about marriage as sort of marriage market where people are optimizing stuff there. So it's powerful in the sense you can apply it to lots of different contexts, but as you sort of start to spread it thinner across the social world, across the social space, to marriage, and so even to racism and things like that, how useful is it? So a lot of people have been very critical of that sort of movement in economics.
Yeah, but I think that's the same with any theory that, or any way of thinking. If you apply it to enough things, it sort of loses its power to a degree, doesn't it? Because then there's more things that can counter it. I think that's just any way of thinking. I think it can't be applied to every scenario and to every other discipline. So
some people, some of the more sort of some of the critics of economics would say that economists have been a little bit overconfident. Or should I use the word arrogant? Maybe the way that they've applied those ideas of sort of optimizing and optimization and sort of rational economic people. Even to another sort of element of it is going back to sort of neoliberal discussion that we were having earlier. It's this whole area of public choice theory, which there's a chapter in the book about public choice theory. The basic idea of which is to apply a kind of optimizing, rational economic person framework to politics itself. So actually that politicians are simply sort of are simply optimizers who are trying to maximize the gains over the costs to them. And so politics is just this big sort of marketplace. It's not really about the classical sort of notion of politics as people who are, a public good, people trying to work for the public good. That's all sort of nonsense. And that's one sort of building block for neoliberalism, has been that sort of notion of politics, which was sort of developed by a school of economists who I talk about. Again, possibly a very, very, I would say, very sort of problematic way of thinking about politics, and probably quite a damaging one in the long run, in the way that it's helped to sort of corrode the idea of politics and of citizenship, that it's just a kind of, it's just a game, a market that grubby politicians are getting into for their own
self-interest.
Because I think there's a reflexivity in these stories that actually the more you tell these stories, the more you create that kind of world. This is not physics. This is about people. This is about the imagination in some respects.
Yeah, it's how it manifests into reality. I think that's the important thing. Like you said, it's not like an experiment that you do in a lab and see how it plays out. It's very much the decisions that a rational actor makes, whether they're a politician or an economist, has real world effects on how people live their lives and on countries and their effects on societies in general.
Yeah.
It was interesting that we just talked about the rational actors, because when I was reading the Veblen, the chapter you wrote on Veblen, and the idea of how we buy things not so much to satisfy our own desires, but to actually be approved by others. And do you think this was a shift from pure economics, from a macro scale, into understanding how our consumption drives human behavior?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's definitely a shift from, it definitely stands slightly apart from mainstream economics for sure, because it's actually not really using any of those economic concepts that I've talked about, optimization. So actually the optimizing, that person deciding between cans of Coke and hot dog, that's sort of almost like that kind of robotic kind of character, is completely in their own bubble. They don't care about really what other people are thinking. They're just, all they care about is their utility function, as they call it, the sort of equation. How do you optimize? That's it. You're just thinking about optimizing for your own well-being and your own utility. But this is a very different, so Veblen was very much, I mean, he was someone who was, yes, he was an economist, but he was really heavily rooted in anthropology and philosophy. I mean, he was this incredibly wide reader. He read all sorts. He spent really the first few decades of his. He was a bit of a loose cannon, hiding on his parents' farm, reading books from all sorts of fields, and I think that shows in his work. So I would say it's very much sort of anthropological, or maybe even sort of psychological notion of economics. So he's sort of saying that rather than being these sort of cool optimizers, we're actually just sort of status seeking people. And he makes an analogy with sort of, I don't know, tribal societies perhaps, where gifts are given not for their utility, but to make a sort of, for reasons of sort of social, reasons of social status. You might give a gift to a more senior person, and there are sort of anthropological works about gift circulation in some of these tribal societies. So I think he uses some of these ideas and says that actually, even in a capitalist society, you might think are a million miles away from those kinds of tribal societies, we're doing pretty much similar sort of thing. So he was writing during the Gilded Age of the rise of the great tycoons, Carnegie and Vanderbilt and so on. And basically saying they're not optimizers, they're just essentially engaging in conspicuous consumption. They're just consuming massive amounts to show that they're wealthy and that their wives don't have to work because they're so wealthy, and it's a kind of status type thing. And of course, I mean, you see that, of course, that's very much in the economy now. You see that among certain, certain segments of the economy, very super rich people and so on. I think there's a lot of insight in there, not maybe the specifics, but also actually thinking about economics as well, providing an alternative to that sort of optimizing framework that actually economics also sort of is to do with the sort of the anthropology of the anthropological context in which it takes place, and the broader sort of institutional framework that you talked about as well, that is quite hard to reduce to these sort of mathematical utility functions. So he's a very sort of interesting, fertile, radical sort of thinker.
Yeah, I think the reason why it connected with me so much is I've been reading a lot about human behavior and psychology really the last couple of months. So that's been my field of reading. That's where I've done a lot of my reading. And I think I look at what's happening at the moment with the internet and social media and that kind of stuff. And it's just a lot of what I call peacocking. A lot of the time is what people do is they show off their status symbols about, I don't know how much they earn, their material goods. It's very, I feel like the consumption at the moment is everything's very material in when it gives people value of. It's not so much on a basis of what value does it give me sort of spiritually. If we're going to go to the medieval times, it'd be done on like, what is spiritually is this giving me? What moral value is this giving me? These items, it's very much what material benefit is it giving me in relation to what people are saying about me or perceive
exactly. And I mean, you know, it's to someone who's not an economist, they might say, well, yeah, that's so obvious. That's not a particularly, you know, big insight that Veblen was making. But actually, in a way, when you set it alongside the sort of dominant way of thinking in economics, which that earlier framework that I was talking about, optimizing and so on, doesn't really have room for that sort of irrational way of engaging with the economy. And you know, I think it was a very sort of powerful idea. So the idea of it, I think we still use in common parlance the sort of term conspicuous consumption, don't we? And that comes from Veblen. Actually, that was his. He coined that phrase. So yeah, it's really important. It's important, and as you say, it's still very much relevant today. I mean, when you look at
very much so.
Yeah.
Related to that, when I was reading the chapter on Schumpeter and on monopolies, I thought it was very timely, because what you're finding at the moment is this big throwback to large organizations, whether it's Amazon, Apple, Google, you know, these large monopolies that are driving what he coins as creative destruction, and how he actually thought that it was a good thing, because it's those companies that really drive innovation because they have the resources to do so. But at the moment, you're finding a massive backlash to these massive organizations, you know, mainly just due to the fact that they don't pay any tax, which is logically just unreasonable based on how much they're making. But do you think that those monopolies in the long term have a negative impact, or do you see as that creative destruction being the driver of jobs and the economy as a whole? But for instance,
I mean,
over the long term, it might have negative effects on society.
I would agree with all of what you just said there. I mean, you know, yes, you do need, so the sort of going back to that sort of we were talking about Alfred Marshall, that way of thinking about the economy that sort of emerged in from his sort of school of economics, was about the sort of dominant way of thinking about markets in which people operated, was this idea of perfect competition. So this idea that there would be no big firms, there wouldn't be no dominant firms, that everyone was having to compete with each other, lots of small firms competing with each other, so no one firm would have any market power. And economists are particularly sort of enamored of that idea, because you can prove all sorts of very nice results about the economic basically you end up with a very efficient economic outcome, because everyone is competing. It maximizes what's called consumer surplus, basically the kind of utility that people get from their goods. Once you introduce these sort of what they call imperfections into the system, one of which is big firms, monopolies that have market power and therefore can actually set their own prices and control prices, you don't get those results anymore. You get all sorts of problems. So that's the root of the kind of dislike of monopolies among economists. I mean, I think that you know, it's a simplistic kind of model, and in practice there are reasons why some firms get very big, because of technology and because of certain structures within the economy that you sort of, that's well, for example, you can't have perfect competition of say like water supply. You couldn't have lots of different firms um, with their own pipes. You
Mm.
basically have one sort of network. So that's what's called a sort of a network monopoly.
I don't think you want that as well.
No, you wouldn't, exactly. So there are actually all sorts of reasons, and what Schumpeter was talking about was for to incentivize sort of this kind of innovative drive that you need for an economy to power forward. You kind of need elements of monopoly to emerge to incentivize that. And I think there's sort of massive insight in what he was saying, and actually some modern economists have used that to create models of the entire economy, growth models based on this idea of elements of monopoly power and their monopoly profit that then drive innovation. And I think that's a really important part of how the economy works. Having said all that, your sort of negative point, which was, but then you do eventually run into problems. Yeah. Absolutely. And if you look at what's going on today with certain companies getting so powerful and then avoiding tax and so on, you have real problems, and you probably need some sort of intervention. And this is why we have regulatory frameworks to deal with that. I mean, the whole question of social media now, of course, is getting much more complex because of what it actually does. I mean, it's not just a giant widget firm or something. It's the firms that supply the space for political discourse, and so it's so much more complex than economics actually when it comes to that stuff. But yeah, it's a really complex one. The idea of an economy made up of lots of little tiny firms that are competing against each other kind of went out the window once the industrial economy started getting going.
But it's interesting over the last year. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but it's interesting over the last year. There's been a big push for small business. There's been companies that are whether they're credit card companies, they're pushing big on small businesses. I know Google's pushing big on small businesses, but I think that I don't know where it's going to go from a monopoly point of view. I know there's a big pushback in America for big companies and sort of the data that they're accumulating, and I think it's just going to become heavily regulated. How that manifests from a technological innovation point of view, I'm not sure. Like, I'm currently reading this book, Life 3.0 by Max Tegmark. It's about artificial intelligence. And in that book, it's saying about we need to get regulators in on artificial intelligence early to basically go through all of this paperwork about what is the regulatory frameworks for artificial intelligence. How does that manifest into the market? Because I think that's where perhaps the social media aspect or the internet was late to, because they didn't do that regulatory framework. And it got to the stage now where you have this massive pushback and that will stall innovation. But then how do you get people in early, like the governments, and set those regulatory frameworks?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm certainly no expert on regulatory framework.
I'm not either.
The thing, but the products that these, as I was coming back to the point that it's the standard economic textbook thinks of a monopoly as a firm selling a very well-defined product, like it's a monopoly for pencils or apples or whatever. But now the products that these Google and Twitter and so on are selling are so sort of complex and fast-moving, and so much connected with actually these sort of intangible things like spaces in which people have debate. Like that's the product that they're supplying. That actually that sort of old type of regulatory framework that you sort of learn about in economics courses seems to be a rather antiquated way of looking at these things now. So it's the sheer speed of technological and social change that surrounds these firms mean that we probably have to think about it in very new ways, particularly in the last few weeks, what's been happening in America and so on.
Yeah, definitely. In the book you talked about the idea of, I mean, we're currently speaking about the backlash to current economic models of thinking, and even to extend out into social and political ways of thinking as well. And economists, you said, call that, in the book you mentioned, a moral hazard, where the actions are unknown. Do you feel like that is part of the reason of the backlash, is there's so many moral hazards related to the system that we currently have, because people don't know how it works and they feel like there is there's definitely injustices in the system, implicit injustices in the system, whichever country you're in. But people are fearing that because there is those moral hazards everywhere.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, yeah, it's yeah, I think that's right. I mean, you know, the idea of moral hazard is in a way, it's a very specific kind of idea in economics, which is that, again, it sounds incredibly sort of commonsensical, but it took economists quite a long time to figure it out, that if markets don't work very well if people don't have all the information about what's going on. So if markets start to get opaque, and people don't really know what's going on, you get all these problems like moral hazard. The other sort of concept connected to that is something called adverse selection. And so if you look at something like the financial crisis, you know, you had this rip, so, you know, so large that, you know, the financial system basically collapsed. And a big part of this was because of really kind of opaque, complex kind of information that no one knew what their products were, even, you know, even the people that were selling these financial products. So you had these enormous sort of moral hazard problems, and with then the bailouts of the banks, you know, this huge sort of moral hazard problem that people worry about. So absolutely, and thinking, using those terms as a sort of metaphor for the sort of broader sense of an economy that's so sort of complex and opaque and subject to sort of power relations that are hard to sort of get behind, then yeah, I mean, it's a really important thing. I mean, again, going back to a lot of standard economics assumes that the economy is this very transparent, rational thing that everyone knows about. One of the sort of big models in economics, sort of so-called rational expectations, that everyone's able to understand the economy and predict what's going to happen, and what's going to happen with policies, and how policies are going to affect the economy, and sort of adjust accordingly. Of course, it isn't like that, and for the most part, people feel kind of confused, and as if they're part of this very opaque system. So yeah.
There was one quote that I found in the book was quite funny. I noted down here: the purpose of studying economics is to learn how to avoid being deceived by economists. I thought that was I thought it was a great quote, because I mean, I think it's true for any field that you are interested in, is how not to be deceived by the experts in that field.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I suppose, and that's really, I mean, that was one of the reasons, I suppose, why I wanted to write the book, was to give people a way to get behind some of these debates. Economics has had I mean, I think people often have quite extreme reactions to it. You know, when you say economics or economists, on the one hand, people sort of, going back to what we were talking about, the maths and the models, oh, this is very complicated stuff, and, you know, I don't understand all the maths, and just leave it to the professionals who sort of understand this stuff. On the other hand, there's often this very, particularly since perhaps the financial crisis, strong antipathy towards economics, that it actually has become too narrow, it's become, you know, outdated, it didn't predict the financial crisis. And then you had, you know, the whole dislike of experts and politicians saying we've had enough of experts, and Brexit and so on. So there's often quite an extreme reaction to it, a rejection of it, or a kind of submissive feeling that, you know, it's something that I can't understand. You know, let's not get involved with it. I suppose what I'm trying to do with this book is to give people a bit of an intermediate point, that actually, yes, you can get behind some of these debates and see where they've come from, and know historically, have a bit of information about where these ideas came from historically, then, and therefore stand in a little bit of a more assertive pose in relation to economics, and it's something that all citizens have to be sort of, that sounds rather quaint word to use, but I think in terms of, you know, thinking about how democracy functions, a well-functioning democracy is one where people are able to engage with these topics, and therefore cast their vote in a way that makes sense for them. So sort of having some kind of way of connecting with economic debates is really important for that.
I think that's where the internet has helped innumerably to get people educated on topics where perhaps they didn't have the information before. I've seen this, especially at the moment. I think there's a growing trend amongst individuals my age, but even younger, especially in their sort of late teens, early 20s. They're questioning the system in a good way, because they have access to information from people who are not experts, or perhaps they are challenging views that were inherently the case. And I think that's really important to get. I recently read a book called Black Box Thinking by Matthew Syed. I don't know if you've read it, but the idea in that is that experts, for instance, are sometimes so entrenched in their ideas of thinking that they hold on to that, and they hold on to failures on their side because, their reputation is on the line. And
of course, absolutely. And I mean, economics is a huge element of that. Particularly when the financial crisis came along, why were people really starting to ask much more urgently, why have economists hung on to these models that seem much too narrow and much too making much too heroic sort of assumptions about human behavior and markets for so long. And the black box thinking idea. I mean, or think of Thomas Kuhn's idea of paradigm shifts. It's not that people see things that conflict with their theory and then say, okay, let's change the theory. They sort of patch the theory up and so on. It's not, because of course people have vested interests in the theory that they're propounding. They're not going to immediately sort of move to a new theory and reject what they've been working on all their lives. So,
that's an interesting thought. What interested me as well was towards the latter end of the book, you start talking about Thomas Piketty, famous economist, and the idea about if there's an inequality in the system, the economic system, is incumbent upon all of us to find a way to change it or adapt it in a way. And you dedicated a chapter to the idea of getting women involved in economics and the power that has from an education point of view. It's not the sense of the idea of the rational actor was always the male person in history and economic thinking, and it's changed. And there was that economics, I forget her name, but she sort of broke the mold in that respect from economic thinking. Where do you think it comes from, the change in economic models? Do you think it's from an education point of view? It's increasing literacy rates, it's getting people educated on what it means to like you said, live in an economy that suits the needs for most?
So hang on. So the question is, how do economic paradigms shift and change? And
what is the vehicle for that? Like in the book, you very much mentioned that implicitly that could be from an education point of view, globally education point of view, getting people more educated, not only on just economics, but just in general, because the more people that become educated, the more people that have, an understanding of the system that we're in. If people don't have literacy rates, then how are they going to know how their economy functions?
Sure. I mean, all that is very, very important. I mean, how economic thought, because I guess, economic thought is driven by, in the first instance, quite a narrow group of people, which is the people that write economics. So, policymakers and, well, in the first instance, I suppose, professors and academics and people that sort of produce the economic literature. How does that stuff change, and how did those paradigms change? I mean, that's a very sort of complicated question of sociology of knowledge, and why do these... I mean, in economics, you can certainly look at some shifts that have happened over the 20th century. I mean, one of those big shifts that I talk about in the book, into sort of Keynesian economics after the war. I mean, that very much came out of a situation of crisis. So you had the Great Depression, and then you had the Second World War, and in a sense, that set of historical circumstances gave birth to a new way of thinking about the economy and a new way of running the economy. And there was this new kind of set of thought that had come from John Maynard Keynes, who'd written his sort of books in the 30s, and that was, in a sense, the world was then ready for those new ideas, which would sort of break from what had come before. And then similarly, later on, the sort of overthrow of Keynes in the 1970s, again, another economic crisis. The world was then ready for Friedrich Hayek, who'd been writing a bit earlier. So there's definitely a kind of crisis element to it. I wonder what's going to come out of because I guess we are in some sort of crisis. I mean, in the sense that, you know, the financial crisis didn't happen so long ago, and we're still sort of dealing with that. And now, of course, COVID, and, you know, it's been a very, very turbulent start to the 21st century. And and then climate change, of course, the big sort of policy problem that's hanging over us. What will that give birth to? I don't know. But how these things change is sort of is really, very, very complex. I certainly think that, you know, I mean, probably the point that I was making in the book about education was to do with democracy, and you know, that for democracies to function, people sort of need to know what's going on, basically. Although otherwise you get some of the problems and the pathologies that we're now seeing in some of the advanced democracies. And that sort of, I think, you know, starting economic and sort of political education very young is really important. We don't do it, you know. That's maybe a slightly separate question to the sort of narrower kind of intellectual one of how do economic schools develop. They are connected though, because of course there's an element, I mean, for example, after the Second World War, there was a sense of society was ready actually for a new kind of economy. It was ready, you know, people had seen how well planning and the government running the economy had worked during the war, and they were then ready for something else. So there's a broader question of how does the public consciousness then connect with whether particular new theories are going to be accepted politically and then used, you know, as a framework for government and economic policy.
I definitely like that idea that you were saying about, it's a bit weird if I say I like the idea of a crisis, but I definitely agree with the idea that it's only through crisis that there's paradigm shifts in ways of thinking, because I think it's like a human nature thing. It's only until things really go bad do we really think about things. Which is, I think, like you said, it'd be interesting to see the fallout of the last year.
Yeah.
Like what impact will that have?
Yeah, absolutely.
So what's next for you then from, I mean, this book came out in, was it 2017, 2018?
2017, so it's been a few years ago. Yeah.
Interestingly enough, how would you have written it differently, knowing what you know now? Would you have introduced anything into the book if you were to write another version of it? What would you adapt and change? I always like to ask that, because I think it's a funny question, because I think, I don't know, some authors say, yeah, I would have changed that, I would have done that differently based on feedback, or people say that, you know, hindsight's 2020 kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I was trying to write a book that didn't, because of the nature of it, that it talks about, you know, an intellectual story that goes back to the ancient Greeks. So in a way, it's quite a timeless sort of story. I mean, I think that was one of the aims of the book, was it was to help people get behind the immediate headlines. So not to write an economics book that's incredibly current and about, you know, Brexit or something, a sort of hot current topic. It was much more of a sort of timeless story than that. So I think a lot of it actually would be the same. How would I mean, the obviously we've had Brexit. There probably would have been more on those sort of issues, and possibly trade issues, and sort of that side of things. Climate change, perhaps. I mean, I've got the final chapter that does talk about climate change. Perhaps there would have been more on that. The issue has, in a sense, sort of accelerated in its urgency since then. But I think in general, it's supposed to tell a kind of big long-term story. So I think a lot of it might not have changed too much.
And as I suggested, next is, we briefly spoke about it before the start of it, but your next book is the idea of utopianism in London. Is that correct?
Yeah, so it's about, so it's a bit of a different, you know, moving away from you know, pure economics writing, really. Well, not that the little history wasn't really pure economics writing, because it had, as you said, sort of history and other things in there, but moving much more towards a sort of narrative type of story about London and about utopianism and the utopian visionaries that have been in the city over the centuries, and how they've thought about the city. And there are bits of economics in there. Of course, a big part of that is how we relate to London as this extraordinary sort of place of commerce and markets that was in a way the first city to really become a big capitalist city, and how utopians have used that as as an inspiration and also as something to rail against. So that's the current book. So a little bit different to this one, but hopefully some big ideas, some big personalities, and a sort of historical sweep to it, which is what you get in both of these books. I like to think about how ideas kind of connect up over time and create a sort of imaginative lineage that we can still use today, and that still informs how we envision things and imagine things.
Definitely. How far are you going back in the utopian then, from a historical
Well, I'm going
point
back to Thomas More in the 16th century. So he invented the word utopia, so that seemed like a great place to start. He was this obviously very famous Londoner at the heart of London life. So it's, in a sense, utopian thought has been going on, predates Thomas More, I would say, but still that seemed like a very, narratively speaking, a very nice place to start.
Yeah, definitely. And I like the idea that you were suggesting about those threads through time.
Yeah.
I think that historical narrative, and I think that's what you did really well in this book, is that what is the thread that holds all of it together? Because you started off the book by talking about the Greeks, and you ended it talking about the Greeks, saying we're still trying to answer their initial question.
Right.
Like, what is the purpose of economics, and what is the purpose of money, and how it dictates our society and us as individuals?
And that maybe we've lost that deeper sense of purpose, like what's it all for? And the Greeks, thought of that in terms of the virtues and what it means to be a good citizen and a fulfilled person. We've maybe lost a bit of that now. We've since the 19th century, created this amazing economic machine, but sometimes one wonders what is it for?
Yeah.
There are some obvious things that it's for. It creates hospitals and schools and big resources to do that. But when you think about something like climate change, you think, okay, what are the downsides of this? So yeah, I think that's why I wanted to circle back to the Greeks, because if you put it within that broader context of human virtue and human well-being and so on, I think you get some other kinds of answers to that question.
Definitely. That's why people should read the book. A little history of economics. No, thank you so much for taking time to speak to us today. It was an absolute pleasure. Where can people find you? Your website?
Yeah. NiallKishtainy.com. That's my website, and you can link to me on Twitter and so on.
Excellent. And we look forward to the new book as well. Sounds fascinating. I look forward to reading it. Thank you once again, and yeah.
Nice speaking to you all.
Nice speaking to you too. Thank you, Niall.